it's time now to turn to our audience questions. I think the cameras are going to be turned on for the audience. I think we're getting out of this view. Is that right? I guess Lacey might need to tell us. But regardless, I will just call. I know people have written their questions in the Q&A, but I am going to call on you to name your questions to our panelists. Seems like we just lost. Okay, what's my view is changing, right? Okay, so I simply am going in the order that things are showing up in the Q&A. And so the first question on my Q&A list is from Nicole Land. But am I incorrect in thinking, okay, here comes everybody else. People are starting to pop in, right? Okay. So I did also see that there are some hands up, but we are only taking questions through the Q&A boxes. So, but I'm feeling a little uncertain. I thought Beth or Lacey that the audience was going to be able to turn on a camera and be.
Yes, so everyone's being promoted to panelists right now. So for those of you who came in as attendees, what we're doing behind the scenes is just switching you over to panelists, so then your camera view will be enabled and you will now be a part of, I guess, the larger Zoom community that we've created just now.
Okay, thanks for that, Lacey. All right, Nicole, if you're there, if you don't mind turning on your camera or your audio and asking us your question.
Sure. I am here. My question has now been eaten by Zoom, so I'm going to ask it kind of on the fly. I had a question about interdisciplinarity and what it means to think within the RECE project with interdisciplinarity, because if I can perhaps like be so bold as to suggest, I don't think that interrogating the ways that RECE is interdisciplinary has happened sort of in a public forum. We'll often say, yes, this work is interdisciplinary, or this work is inspired by interdisciplinary scholarship. But in terms of kind of imagining an ethos or practices or accountabilities for a way forward of thinking what it is to think with interdisciplinary scholarship within the world of children and curriculum and families and lives and questions of who the human is and what is to come of worlds we make together. So my questions are sort of how for the panelists might we think about the process and the work of thinking in interdisciplinary ways, and how can we think of it as more than just an epistemological challenge, and instead put it towards, as Veronica described, questions of worlding and world making, but in particular ways specific to the evolving trajectory of concerns of the shared RECE project.
So I believe that these questions are going to the panelists. If anyone had any thoughts about that project or about that question.
Nicole, sorry, I think she's gone. Are you there?
Yep, she's there.
Okay, hi. I was just wondering, when you say interdisciplinary, what disciplines do you mean? Like, what are you referring to exactly?
I think that's part of the question I'd like to offer to the panelists, and maybe it's partially a question of what are the interdisciplinary borders of the projects that we work on, and also what are the ethical and political decisions we make about the knowledges we decide to bring to our work, and the knowledges that we either choose not to, or that perhaps existing disciplinary boundaries tell us we shouldn't.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I was just thinking about like when we think about discipline and disciplinary, I think like those things may also be considered as colonial concepts. So thinking about discipline and what we think about a particular discipline and whether we're following it or not. So just like starting there. And I know that many teachers and researchers, we are inclined towards our own perspectives and epistemologies and worldviews. So I guess it's difficult to be very interdisciplinary, but I know that in collaborative work, a lot of that comes through where you learn from each other if you're doing the work together. So I think that can be achieved if we are working again collectively and not individualistically. So that's just my 2 cents about that.
I think I might be wrong, but I think I hear Nicole raising the question of whether we need to be challenged, that whether the idea of interdisciplinarity exists as kind of an empty signifier that we all just take for granted, or if we need to be thinking and challenging what we think and do related to this notion of interdisciplinary, or if it's so already assumed that we know what it means that we're missing important things. I think that's what I heard in your question. All right, yeah. So I'm going to leave that there because I think part of what this panel is doing is raising what are the questions that, that should be mattering for us moving forward. So I think Nicole's got one out on the table, which is, are we taking our sense of interdisciplinarity for granted? Do we need to interrogate that in order to open it up? I heard, for example, Veronica mentioning, that she's doing work with Donna Haraway. And if you've read Donna Haraway's, Veronica, living with the trouble, living close, being with, yeah.
Staying with the trouble, or
Yeah, staying with the trouble.
Staying with the trouble.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a brilliant example of maybe the kind of interdisciplinary that Nicole is pointing toward potentially. But anyway.
Yeah. And perhaps it's even a question of ethics, right? How do we make decisions about what are the different knowledges that we attend to?
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yes,
So-
I just wanted to,
Please.
oh, sorry. Just wanted to, I had a quick response to that notion of, the boundaries, is that we're all about breaking those boundaries down and not reinforcing them. But I did want, in terms of structurally the way we operate as RECE, I just wanted to put a reminder out there that, so we're sort of giving substance to what it is we stand for in terms of our remit from the Indigenous caucus that was established in New Mexico. And one was, just a reminder that some of those ideas are reminding us about the acknowledging us as human beings and acknowledging our lands and having a way that we can identify ourselves within the structure of the RECE, and also putting in, finding spaces for collaborations Indigenous to Indigenous, so that wherever we are in the world, that we're able to, find one another as Indigenous peoples, because that's really important. So even within our spaces, whether we're in the tertiary sector or out in centres, we're always thinking about these our positionings, but even within how we operate as RECE. So that was a very important move or endeavour to be much more to look at the structures of our organisation and the way that we move in the future, and in terms of reconceptualising everything under the sun.
So we only have time for a handful of these questions. So I'm going to move on to one that is showing up several times, or at least a few times. I see Nicola has raised the question. I think Shirley also raised the question about teaching. So Nicola or Shirley, or both of you, maybe you'd like to raise your questions.
My question had more to do with the curriculum than simply teaching. I want to know how the panelists would respond to the question, what should we teach? In light of the ideas that you've expressed, what should be the content of the curriculum?
And before you answer that, if Nicola's around, maybe she could also add her part of the question to that. don't know. I will say, then I don't hear her, so I'll say, relatedly, Shirley, Nicola asks, sorry, I'm trying to roll, I've scrolled through too many things. What do we need to learn? How do we learn authentically in everyday moments? Like Veronica said, what does it mean to be a human? For children, how can they contribute to the world and make it a better, meaningful place for them? So
Yeah,
I would think,
I want to focus on what should we teach in the classroom? What should the curriculum be?
yeah, and I saw Nicola's question being that as well. So anyway, to the panelists.
Let me pick this up and maybe kick it off, and then it can sort of bounce around in our panel. I think the idea of curriculum in terms of what do we teach or what should children learn in the classroom settings or in schools is quite problematic, because the formation of curriculum itself is a process of that needs to be critically investigated in terms of the power relations and whose voice and whose knowledge. These are that type of critical theories, orientations that we can play with. And when I say play, because we are in early childhood education and play is a serious business. So I don't mean play in the leisure play type of notion. And play has become for me, I think it's a empty signifier. That we talk about play, but we use it as an empty signifier to mean multiple things. And in practice, for example, when we put play in curriculum and then make it play-based learning, then play-based learning is also intertwined with that notion. For example, here in Australia, we talk about intentional teaching. So play-based learning and intentional teaching that, again, drag us back to that dichotomous kind of classification about power relations and who needs to be taught and what we need to learn and what is deemed as meaningful play in the classroom settings. Therefore, I think when we come to discuss that notion of curriculum itself is a very problematic and highly politicized and highly racialized kind of decision-making process.
I agree, it is. But I want to know, you've all expressed some fabulous ideas, but I want to know what the implications are for what we teach in the classroom. The curriculum, as I see it, is fundamental to the educational process. It is the centerpiece of what we do as educators. And yet, very few people want to come out and say what it is that some of your ideas have to do with this fundamental process that is education.
Shirley, I'm quite interested. Oh,
sorry, who is that?
I have a bit of a delay.
Oh, Veronica, yes. I would imagine you'd have a lot to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm quite interested in questions of curriculum and pedagogy, and without going into like details, I do work with educators in Canada and educators in Ecuador on a weekly basis in creating a curriculum, making a curriculum with what it is that we have in front of us, or that the children have in front of us, and paying attention to the world. And perhaps it's not, I wouldn't say that I know about teaching, and you probably didn't mean it this way, but it's not so much about applying an idea and teaching children a particular concept or a particular idea, but rather creating spaces for thinking together with children. We have I'll add in the chat a website that you can take a look at some of the work that we have been doing with different groups of educators to think about pedagogy as subject formation and through curriculum making. So we are doing work with children, yet thinking about the creation of a different kind of human that is deeply connected with the world, a human that will be worldly and so on, all of the ideas that we were discussing before.
So
Marcel,
I think we have a lot of questions. So I think what we're trying to do is raise some questions for ongoing conversation. So I'm going to move on. And we have a really interesting question from anonymous attendee, but I don't actually see anonymous attendee's name showing up on the screen. If you're here, anonymous attendee, that would be great, but I'm also happy to read the question. So I'm going to go ahead. It says, the question says, for communities that are worrying about day-to-day living and how to move out of poverty, are parents from vulnerable groups wrong to want a, quote, good education for their children, even if it means that this education is merely to guarantee success in a neoliberal world? I like that question.
That is something I was thinking about also when, so I'm from India originally. I've taught in India for 14 years, and then I came to the US. And I was in the Rita Gold Early Childhood Center at Teachers College, which is amazing. I learned so much more about emergent curriculum and how curriculum comes from the child and how we can use the children's interests to, form the whole curriculum and construct around that. And like, that was just a magical space for me, because I was like, wow, this is such a privilege to have a space like this for children where they can actually take ownership of what they learn. So I think that is also a question of power and privilege. Which children are given those experiences? Which children have those opportunities and resources to have teachers, educators with those mindsets that can have an emergent curriculum? So like in India, it's so different. We're training 3-year-old children how to take entrance exams and tests, at least in my experience. They are doing worksheets. 2.5-year-old children are going to, private tuitions so they can learn how to take a test to get into preschool. So it's just, this is my experience. I know that there are many different types of schools in India, but this is what I've seen. So I'm just thinking about how these privileges also play out in the way curriculum is constructed and curriculum is implemented in classrooms. So when we think about global and local, it's nice to talk about it, but then the reality is very different because the expectations for different children are very, very different.
Yeah, yes, I'd like to respond to that. I think that even that I've often thought, working in Kohanga Reo, sometimes we couldn't help but flip back into a mainstream way of operating, if I might put it that way. But part of the way that we worked around curriculum within Kohanga Reo, of course, it was all through the medium of Te Reo Māori. We were just one step ahead of the children. But it wasn't like we had a fixed up curriculum. It was like, we're all in this together. What do you value? What do we value? Let's work together. I remember one of the questions asked of me as a practitioner in Kohanga is, we would be quite active in the activist space. And so there was a big protest on about land, and we wanted to take the children on that journey and that become part of the curriculum. And the thinking was, but you're here to provide a service. I can't come, but you can't go doing that kind of thing. And resisting that notion of that we're there to provide a service, because that's when you really get into problems. And so you can, within a mainstream neoliberal kind of curriculum system, you still can resist. I mean, that's the point. Wherever children in whānau are positioned, in whatever circumstances, resistance can happen and ought to happen in those spaces. But yes, the notion of a fixed curriculum is to be really dismissed because it's problematic. So that has implications for the way we will learn and think and work together with young children and families, rather than teachers in control of the curriculum.
But I think also when we're together here as this group with participants from all over the world, we also need to talk about the concept of curriculum, because a curriculum isn't a curriculum in all the different spaces that we're from. And in Norway in early childhood, the term curriculum doesn't actually really make sense when I compare it to how the curriculum was presented to me when I was working together with kindergarten teachers in South Africa, for example. So and I think it's important to critique the idea of what a curriculum is, but it can also be as interesting in this group to discuss or to try to imagine or rethink what a curriculum can be and how that curriculum then can be constructed or can come alive in settings together with children. And then we need to talk about the politics of curriculum making and the power relations regarding curriculum making. Who is in a position to be the one defining what the curriculum should be, how detailed, for example, it should be, or the values that should be the ground for the curriculum. And I think, and that's why I liked what you were saying, Ifang, very well, because I think play, you were saying that was an empty signifier, right? And I think that's interesting to talk about play and play-based learning, all those concepts, because we need to take back, support children in taking back play and what play is. Children have the right to play. And we then need to, in the case of Norway at least, invite and discuss with the politicians who are making the framework plans and the curriculum, what play can be from a child's perspective, and how play and a holistic view on play, not an instrumentalistic understanding of how we can use play to reach the goals that we have defined as adults or in a power position, but actually to rethink what then play can be in collective processes inspired by and together with children and the families locally. I think that's something. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about what is actually taught in classrooms, but we can also listen to each other and be inspired of different ways that the curriculum is constructed, and try to work with that when we're facing the ones that are empowered to construct or impose curriculum onto institutions.
Well, there are several other questions, and we are out of time. And the good thing is we have more webinars to come, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I have just been absolutely holding my breath for the day when we learn about there being a live conference again, where we might all be together. So it's good to know that we have many, many conversations yet to be had. So with that, I'm going to thank the panelists very much. Thank the audience, thank people who gave these questions, and apologies to those whose questions I was not able to get to. But it's time to turn it over to Mimi. So off you go, Mimi.
Okay. I didn't. When you said we were over, Gail, I thought maybe we were completely over. What a sigh of relief I had.
No, I kept track of time.
So I do have just a couple minutes, and so much I could say. If you could see my dining room table filled with notes and papers, you'd say, oh, not again. But anyway, maybe I'll collect them. But I wanted to thank everybody, mostly all the panelists and speakers. It really went off, in my opinion, beautifully. And all the questions are very important. I read through them as we went along. And all the people who have stayed were from many corners of the earth, many people that I've known for many years, and others that are brand new to the webinar and possibly the RECE community. So first of all, because of lack of time, I wanted to say that the next webinar, just to remind you, is November 29th at 7 p.m. in Europe and the USA, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, USA. Are you there? Yep.
Yes.
And on the 30th, around 11 a.m. in the Australia and New Zealand area, it might be different. But, and then to email Mark Tassar, whose email I don't have right here, to be on MailChimp announcements. Otherwise, I'll be putting stuff up on Facebook. So I just wanted to say, I have about 2 minutes, I think, that I've had the fortune, many of you know that, and Shirley Kessler and Beth Swabner, Joe Tobin, Jonathan Sillen, Gail Bolt was there fairly early on, I think. And quite a few of you have been with us for 30 years, 25 years, 20 years, 10 years, and maybe just 0 years. Marcella, who's on the panel, helped me in an airport develop the Facebook page about 11 years ago. We just did it on the fly while we were waiting for a plane. I think maybe Ifan, you were there too, right? And a few other people. And so I have a lot of memories. I remember that in year 6 that Nicola Yelland and Susan Greischeiber and Christine Woodrow were there from Australia, and it was in Madison, and I had never seen it. I never thought that we'd have an international participant, and so I wasn't very good as a host for them, but they said that they had read Shirley Kessler and Beth Swabner's book, Reconceptualizing the Early Childhood Curriculum, and had, I think, been invited in. Now we're into talking about things that we did talk about up to 30 years ago, the individualization of a child. In 1992, that's how old I am. I remember that somebody at a DAP panel where Sue Bredekamp was a respondent. I believe it was Rebecca Cantor and David Fernie, and then Michael O'Loughlin mentioned that we should be talking about the collective and the social child. And at the time, I think it went in and out of everybody's ears. And so I wanted to raise, just in the last moment that I have, some of the challenges that I still think that we have as a RECE community. Many of the things that we were worried about years ago are still present, but in different forms, because there are greater inequities. And I don't know whether to say it darker forces, but narrowing forces still very much around us in terms of the PISA assessments and the different ways in which people are focusing on standards in schools and the sort of narrowing of the curriculum that's happening in the US as we speak, I think. There are good parts and bad parts to all of this, but it reminds me again that in this wonderful presentation by all of you, that I still worry that we have wonderful issues and that we're often talking to ourselves, whether it's in publications or in a webinar format. So I wanted to raise a challenge to RECE that we continue to have these wonderful dialogues and superb points that are raised, but that we also really work on. And I think several of the people on the panel have been doing this. And so I'd look for them to really guide us in the techniques that they've been doing. Several people, all people in the RECE community, but how to have the most positive way to impact outward and to move the challenging ideas into the broader community of teachers and families and policymakers and so forth. And again, I know that multiple people here are doing that. And I just feel that sometimes we're successful, but we don't communicate that well enough so that these great ideas, some of them just the narrowness of them persist over all these years, maybe in different forms and expanded ideas and so forth. But I do think that's a challenge and in the US as we face what we could call technical procedural reforms, once again, for the early childhood care and educational community, and the divisions of policy for the infant toddler group versus the universal 3K, 4K group. If you followed any of the reforms that are being proposed and maybe voted on within a week or so, I feel that we also we're repeating the wheel of narrow technocratic reforms that are embedding the standards and the sort of push down of a sort of standardized child into the curriculum. So I feel that there are a lot of challenges still for the RECE community. I cherish everything that you've all talked about, and I may not be here in the next 30 years. That's to Veronica, I think, who suggested that what we should do in the next 30 years. But I challenge all of you to keep on this great work and to go even further, challenge yourself further. And I look forward to the next 2 webinars, and I hope that all of you will be back. And I think the last thing I wanted to say again is thank you to Gail Bolt in particular, who accepted the challenge of being the moderator for this great group. And every single one of you was asked to be on the panel with attention to diversity of region and the global and the local. And that's another challenge we have, how to deal with the global and the local within RECE and beyond RECE. Thank you so much.